So now on to our featured presentation tonight. Before we get started, as we get started, I'd like to ask you to take yourself in your mind anyway, out of Zoom world, out of the couch or basement or dining room table where you're sitting, and think back in your mind for one of those mornings after a big storm, maybe the first morning after the first big storm in a while. All that untouched powder was waiting for you. Or recollect a day when it was just snowing, snowing, and snowing when you're out in the backcountry, snowing so hard, nearby trees were ghosts and dim shadows, the snow piled up on your sled or your pack every time you stopped moving. What was that feeling? Something like excitement, something a little crazed, something our speaker tonight might term arousal. Tonight, Dr. Jordi Hendricks will examine how feelings stimulated by riding powder influence our decisions in the backcountry. The study is part of a larger effort funded by the Norwegian Research Council that's titled the White Heat Project. It explores social factors that motivate our decisions in the backcountry. Dr. Hendricks has spent 2 decades working on snow and avalanche projects across the world. He is currently an associate professor at Montana State University, where he directs the Snow and Avalanche Laboratory in the Earth Sciences Department. The titles of his 100+ peer-reviewed scientific papers show interest ranging from atmospheric circulation to the connections between social aspirations and risk-taking behavior. Dr. Hendricks lists Peter Scheer among his heroes in the snow and avalanche science world. He, his wife, and their 2 daughters enjoy getting into Montana's mountains as much as possible, though, as he told me, there was a significant learning curve coming from New Zealand where there are no large animals that want to eat you. So after he concludes his talk, we'll have a facilitated Q&A session. You can ask your questions during the talk through the Q&A box. You can submit as many questions as you want. We'll combine topics and get through as many questions as possible before we close. Okay, Jordi, over to you.
All right, so thank you for inviting me tonight to this workshop. Really excited to be part of the lineup for tonight and the weekend. So as Blaze said, some of the work I've been doing more recently has been looking at sort of how our emotions, how what we feel influences what we might do in the backcountry. And this work is done in collaboration with my co-authors here, Andrea Manberg and Jerry Johnson. And Andrea is at the UIT, the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and Jerry is here at MSU. And there should be one other author there called Alden Hetland, who's also at UIT, and for some reason I've left him off. I'll mention the White Heat Project a number of times tonight. If you're at all interested, please Google the White Heat Project, and a number of our papers are up there. So I think the last time I came and spoke up at the Northern Rockies, I probably mentioned something about the Ski Tracks project. And if that doesn't ring a bell, I'll just very quickly remind you. But basically, this is a project where we were looking at tracking people in the backcountry. And we were using a smartphone app to track you in the backcountry. That would allow us to collect data on where you were going, how you were moving in the backcountry. And then we would analyze that GPS track. And we would try and understand the terrain metrics of where you actually went. At the same time, we would combine that with a pre and post season survey. And the idea was that by understanding where you went and asking some questions about how you went about the decision making, we'd have this complete picture around how you make decisions and how you move in the backcountry. And to a certain extent, I think that's true, but it still left a lot of uncertainty around what you did. What we did see in general was that avalanche education was important. We saw that the group you were with was really important. And we also saw that group size was important. Bigger groups tended to maybe make poorer decisions. And we think that's attributed towards how communication maybe breaks down in those situations. So all in all, we collected about 5,000 tracks from all around the world. And here's just an example of some of those tracks. This is some tracks from Teton Pass in Wyoming, and you can see The reds represent considerable hazard days. The blues represent moderate hazard days. And what we could see was that people choose different terrain as a function of the hazard, but also more critically, as a function of their gender, as a function of their experience, and as a function of their avalanche education. So what we see is that people are using avalanche information, they're using information about the snowpack, but there's also group and individual factors that determine how they move in that backcountry. So what that means for us as researchers is that for us to be able to understand and hopefully prevent future accidents, we need to know about the snow, absolutely critically. We can't do anything in the avalanche world without understanding the snowpack and snow mechanics. But we also need to understand who you are as a person. Furthermore, the ski tracks work really only gave us a tenuous understanding of the motivations for the observed risk behavior. So we could see where you went, but we are still left kind of going, well, why are you doing that? What motivates you to be in these areas? And obviously good snow is part of that, but what else is motivating that? So this is where the White Heat Project started. And I was very fortunate to be contacted by Andrea Manberg. And Andrea reached out to me and she'd heard my talk about the ski tracks. And she's like, wow, you know, I'm an economist, but I'm really interested in backcountry skiing and risk. And what you've got is this really cool database of where people actually go. And what I think I can do is help you understand why. And that's really one of the key focal points of the White Heat Project. So the White Heat Project is a collaboration between a group of researchers at the UIT, the Arctic University in Norway and Tromsø, and Montana State University here in Bozeman, Montana. And also some researchers from Umeå University in Sweden. The project is based at the Center for the Avalanche Research in Education. It's called the CARE Center at UIT. And the project's been funded by the Norwegian Research Council. This is very similar to the NSF here in the US. And the overall aim of the project is to generate new and usable knowledge on excessive risk-taking behavior in general and on factors behind decision errors in avalanche terrain in particular. So we're not trying to stop you take risk. I think taking some risk is healthy, but it's understanding why you take risk beyond a certain point and how maybe we can intervene or understand when people are maybe potentially going to take excessive risk beyond what they might be willing to take if they were to make a conscious decision around their risk tolerance. And that's really one of the key focuses, is kind of matching that risk perception versus that risk reality and bringing those two together so that people understand, okay, I'm taking risk, that's fine. We all want to take risk at certain times, but making sure that those two things are really tightly connected. And to do that, we've got a really exciting team, and it required a diverse team. So the lead of this project is Andrea Manberg. Andrea is a behavioral economist. You heard Blaze and both Dan talk about the AAA talk that was on just last week by George Lowenstein. And George Lowenstein basically invented the science of behavioral economy. So if you're interested in this area, certainly take a look at the AAA webpage and have a look at his talk. It's fantastic. Andrea is also in this field. Myself, a snow scientist based here at MSU in Bozeman, thinking about snow, terrain, and risk. And then Alden Hetland, he is a psychologist, and his work is focused on risky decision-making. And his PhD actually looked at understanding how base jumpers make decisions about risk. And in many ways, backcountry skiing and base jumping have a lot of parallels. There are some hazards that we know about. There are some unknown hazards that we don't know about. And when we make mistakes, they can be fatal. And we may not be able to learn from that process. This wicked learning environment that's common to base jumping and also to backcountry skiing. And then finally, also Jerry Johnson here at MSU, and he looks about risk and decision-making, and he's had a focus on public lands, but also around how people and also organizations make risk decisions. So what are we going to be doing? Well, one of the exciting projects that I want to talk to you about tonight is looking at how people make individual choices around risk. And one of the ways that we dealt with this is looking at hypothetical choices. So what we did is we launched a survey, and maybe some of you took the survey, and if you did, I want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this research, because any survey is only as good as its participants. So once again, thank you. But what we did is we had a hypothetical survey and hypothetical choices within this survey. And what we did in there is we presented you with a series of choices. So we said, now imagine you're in the backcountry. Imagine you're out with a favorite group of people that you regularly ski with, and the conditions are so, they're actually moderate hazard, and we're mostly loose powder, and we have some soft wind slabs from recent storm, and you tour up this hill, and you're presented with these 4 amazing choices to go and ski. And they're basically of increasing levels of risk. We have the ridge, which is basically coming down the way you went up, very low exposure, very low risk. We have the field, a little riskier. We have the bowl, riskier again. And then we have the chute, which is riskier again. And obviously there's no mountain in the world that has these 4 choices right there, but this is a hypothetical choice survey. And what we did is we looked at your stated preference. We asked you, what would you like to do? And then we also asked you, hey, somebody in your group has said they would actually prefer to ski over here. Would you accept their choice if it's riskier than your original choice? So we're looking at both what you would prefer to do and also what you'd be willing to accept. And this sort of gives us a measure of sort of your risk plasticity. So sort of how much were you prepared to stretch your risk tolerance to the conditions and to the group. And then we also looked at we asked about your experience, your education, and we also asked some general demographic questions. And we had about 450 odd people that participated in that work. So what do we find out about this? So we found out that attitudes and perception of risk predict our hypothetical choices in terrain. So the way we feel about risk, what we're prepared to accept, will be somewhat indicative about the choices we make in these hypothetical cases. That's not rocket science. I think anyone who's done any psychology work or any risk analysis work can accept that straight away. The other one that I thought was really interesting was that riders accept a ski terrain that is riskier than their most preferred. So we see that a good percentage of our population that did this test had some level of plasticity where they would prefer to ski run A or B or C, but hey, maybe they'd do B or C or D if their group was keen on doing that. So then the question is why? Why would you do something greater than what you prefer? Why would you accept to ski something greater than you prefer? And it comes down to social factors. And one of the ones that we saw was that social admiration was important in terms of decisions related to risk. So if we desire to be part of a group, if we want admiration from our fellow tourers, then that might influence us to make a riskier choice than what we're comfortable with. Interestingly, neither experience nor travel skills predict our acceptance to risky terrain, but it did predict our preference. So as we got more skilled, as we got better at moving in the terrain, we might have a greater preference towards those steeper runs, those more exposed runs, but maybe not our tolerance to accepting that steeper run. So I think that's a really important concept, is that, you know, as we gain our education, that it changes how we behave in that area. And if you're interested in reading more about this paper is posted up on the White Heat Project webpage, or take a look at the title there. And it is it's a public accessible journal article. So a lot of journals are blocking access unless you're a subscriber and pay thousands of dollars like a university does. But this one's a public access one. So please take a look at this if you're a little bit more interested in this. So the next thing we're interested in was this idea around positional preferences. Now, if I was standing in front of a live audience, I'd say, hey, hold your hand up if you've heard about positional preferences. Now, unfortunately, I can't do that, and I am getting no feedback here on how I'm doing, so it's hard for me to get this feedback. But positional preferences may not be what you think they are. So positional preferences is an economic term. And it's basically this idea that if an individual is positional, that means that she or he not only cares about the absolute level of consumption of various goods and activities, but also cares about how this level compares to that of others. You might have heard of this as keeping up with the Joneses, all right? So here in the US at the moment, the van life is very big, right? Everyone wants to go get a camper van or an RV and go get away from the world and get away from COVID. And, you know, maybe your van looks like this, all right? This blue van here on the left-hand side. It's got a fantastic bed on it. You can stash your mountain bike or your skis down the bottom, and you're perfectly happy with that, right? No problem at all. You got that parked in your front driveway, and then all of a sudden, your neighbor turns up with this. And you're like, really? Come on. Like, look at this thing. It's like a $300,000 house on wheels. Like, it's got everything to it. Now, if you're positional, you feel that your van, your blue van over there, is now worth less, or you feel that it's worth less because your neighbor has more. This is that idea of positionality where we're trying to keep up. We're trying to keep up with the Jones. We're trying to keep up with your neighbors. And when we don't, we feel less on ourselves. And in economics, it's really well researched that in terms of material goods, some people, a good chunk of the population, care about this stuff. All right. We care about what car we have. We care about what our neighbor's car is. We care about not having the latest skis. All right. And some of us do, some of us don't. But the people that sell us stuff know this stuff matters. This is what drives the economy, right? Is this positionality idea. So they stem from our need to be an accepted member of a social group that is important to us. So going back to these photos before, if we associate with the van life and we think we've got a pretty fancy blue van, and then all of a sudden our neighbor turns up with this $300,000 house on wheels, we might feel less because that's a community we feel part of, right? We're all herd members. We all want to be part of some community. So that's what matters. In my world, I think about skis, right? I think about some nice skis. I turn up, I'm perfectly happy with my skis, and I see, geez, they've got the newer skis a little bit lighter. I could probably shave 15 grams off my skis, where the reality is that I could probably shave 15 pounds off my waistline and make a much bigger difference. But I focus on the skis, and then maybe I buy new skis later in the season. So anyway, this is what around acceptance of our social group that becomes more important. It makes us want to be good enough in the eyes of others. We feel good. If we don't, we feel bad. So it's part of our identity and how we feel as an individual. And it's problematic because it creates this sort of arms race, this buying for just for the sake of buying. And therefore, in an economic sense and in a material sense, it's a waste of resources. It's not the most efficient way to run things, but it's kind of what happens in many circles. So this is why we care about positional preferences. So economics tells us that with regards to material goods, a good number of us are positional. So again, I'd ask for a raise of hands, who's positional, who's not for material goods. But if I could look at you all across the crowd, I would imagine that at least half of you would have at least a full arm up or maybe half an arm up and say, hey, I am kind of positional and maybe I care a little bit about this. And some of you will be like, not at all, don't care, perfectly happy. I don't care what my neighbor does, I'm perfectly happy. So we do see both sides of that. The question is, how many of us are positional for recreational activities? And what we see is that may not be connected. People that care about material goods and are positional about material goods may not be positional about recreational activities. Or vice versa, where if you care about recreational activities, you care about being able to ski the line or be able to mountain bike or ride that particular ridge, that might be more important to you. So what we see is there's also positionality in recreational activities. And then if there is, does that influence your decision making? Are you doing things because you want to maintain your position relative to others, or are you trying to attain a position relative to others? And does that make you do things that maybe you just wouldn't do under a different circumstance? And to answer that, we only need to look a little bit at something like social media. Take a glance through Instagram, through Facebook, and you'll see a series of photos like these. And almost all of those photos, if you look at skiing photos, if you look at climbing photos, if you look at even mountain biking photos, how many of those photos are showing people just cruising the green run, just cruising the meadow with lots of trees on 20-degree slope and blow powder? Almost all of them are not showing that. Almost all of them are showing a steep line, right? An amazing peak, the line you want to ski. So what we see is that through social media, we're certainly pushing out this persona around how this matters to us and how this matters to us as a community. So we thought we'd try and look at this in a little bit more detail. So the way we did this was, again, using a survey. And we stated a question that said, imagine a weekend where you've been out riding, skiing, snowboarding, telemarking, snowmobiling, riding, very general term. You rode terrain that you judged to be safe and responsible given the avalanche conditions, and your riding and terrain management skills. So consistent with what you are comfortable with. The snow conditions are good. Now imagine that you learned afterwards that the riding others did in your social group that weekend. All right. How would your experience level of satisfaction with your weekend be affected by the following situations? And presuming no accidents occurred. You rode more challenging terrain than others did, or others rode more challenging terrain than you did. Now, for the purpose of our survey, we considered you to be a positional person if you said both that you were more satisfied if you had more challenging terrain than others, and that you were less satisfied if others had rode more challenging terrain than you. So you had to do both. That's then when we termed you a positional rider. All right. So then you had positional attributes according to our survey. So who is a positional rider? We found that about a third of the people that we surveyed were considered to be positional riders, 32%, almost exactly a third. I would suspect that it's actually more than that, but our survey may not have been the perfect instrument to measure that. We found that those people were more likely to post pictures of bold lines on social media, not the mellow lines, not the cruisy lines, not them getting lunch at the cafe or lunch on the top of the hill, but something sort of that said something about them and their riding. They also think that riding bold lines will generate respect from their friends. They admire riders who ski bold lines, and they talk to friends about skiing bold lines and really not so much about going on the mellow lines, the cruisy lines, the safer lines maybe. So all of this is interesting, but does it influence risk? All right, so talking about these things, saying these things, what does it actually mean in terms of risk? We can say one thing, but maybe we do something else. So let's have a look at that. Well, the way we could look at this was again using our hypothetical choice scenarios. So we asked them then, here are some scenarios. They were different to the previous survey we had. We don't want to have survey fatigue with these scenarios. So we presented these scenarios and said, which one would you prefer? Would you accept? So again, the same sort of idea. We provided a scenario with regards to the avalanche forecast, with the avalanche problem, and various information about the snowpack. So enough information that at least at a pre-trip planning phase, you could make an educated choice about what you would prefer to do and maybe what you would accept to do given the group. And then we call those the field and the bowl. So our positional riders, these people that care about their social status with regard to riding, more willing to ski a potentially risky line. Again, if I was in a public audience, maybe I'd hear some yeses and some nos. Well, the answer is yes, absolutely. So from the statistics that we saw from that, we saw that the probability to accept a steeper line than they would prefer increased with positional riders. So people that cared about positionality were more likely to accept a steeper line. The other part to this too is that while education was important in terms of reducing the probability to accept, there's still always a difference between those that are positional, as shown in that orange line in that graph there, and the yellow line, which is the non-positional riders. See, the orange is always above the yellow there. So what that says is that education does matter, but that positional people continue to be positional regardless of education, and that they are still more willing to accept that riskier line. So what that says is that's innate in us and how we choose to accept risk or look at risk in the backcountry. We find that positional riders are significantly more likely to boast about riding bold lines, are more likely to associate steep riding with social respect, are more likely to say they would accept to ride a potentially risky line, and that is present regardless of the level of avalanche education, that difference between positional and non-positional people. Again, we've just finished a paper on that. It's called Risky Positioning, Social Aspirations and Risk-Taking Behavior in Avalanche Terrain. And that one's available for free online as well. So if you're interested in this, you want to read a little bit more about the details, please take a look at that. It's available for you as a download, and you can read some more of those details. So just coming back to the positionality, we also recognize that there's some limitations. And we want to provide you with just an overview here. So what we see is there's a desire to get social respect from peers, seems to play a role in risk-taking behavior. And any of you that are a teenager or were once a teenager will recognize this, right? There's probably a time in your life where you maybe did something that wasn't the smartest because you wanted to get some respect or some peer esteem from your cohort, all right? A lot of us grow out of that, but not all of us do. And some of us change our peer group or the way that we want to see respect from our peer group, and that changes over time. We do want to recognize a key limitation is that we use these hypothetical choices, right? We said, imagine about this and imagine about this. That's different to real world. We recognize that. The real world is different. There's a multitude of factors that go on making decisions about what you do when you go into backcountry. So this is a blunt instrument that gives us at least some idea about what's happening. And we do have some work ongoing right at the moment that tries to merge what you say you would do in a survey with what you actually do. And I mentioned that right at the beginning, the Ski Tracks project. We have over 5,000 GPS tracks from around the world of what people actually do. And some of those people also did a hypothetical choice survey. So now we can start comparing, this is what you did in the backcountry versus this is what you said you might do in a hypothetical choice. And that'll give us a better understanding about how robust or how powerful our surveys are. In terms of outlook, in terms of this positionality work, you know, I think what's important here is that the things that give respect depend on the social norms present in our peer group. And social norms and social groups change over time for a range of reasons. So like I said before, when you're a teenager, maybe doing kind of stupid stuff was part of what was cool in your peer group, and that was what got you peer esteem. As our industry evolves, as we encourage more and more education, I feel that the social norms in the avalanche world are really, really geared towards making sensible choices and being safe. So what I'd say is that we as members of the avalanche community, and if you're here tonight, you're a member of that community, can change those social norms by modeling really good behaviors. And that's a challenge I put out to you, is model good behavior, because that's what's going to define those social norms. The other thing is that we need to reflect on our motivations. So think about what is driving you to make that decision. Are you skiing that line because that's a line you want to ski? Or is it a line because you want to put that image on Instagram that says, this is what I ski, guys, check this out, right? And thinking about choosing your ski buddies wisely. So thinking really critically about who's there, who are you with, and how do those individuals influence your decision-making processes. Again, we've got a paper that looks at this a little bit more. It's called Are You Keeping Up with Jeremy Jones? It's a play on the idea of keeping up with the Joneses. I will say that Jeremy Jones is actually a really good role model in terms of showing and modeling good behavior in the backcountry and the processes that go into decision making. So it's really just a play on words, but thinking about what our actions are and why we're making the choices that we are. So that's the end of my positionality talk. I now want to move on to powder arousal. So we've talked about positional preferences, which are not maybe what you thought they were. And now we're going to talk about powder arousal. So who gets excited about powder? I know I do. I know I get very excited about powder. I also get frustrated when the lift lines are full or the trailhead's busy and I can't get to the areas I want to ski powder. But when it's snowing in town and I know it's amazing snow in the mountains, I'm excited, right? I want to go and enjoy that snow. I get excited about this time of year when I start seeing the snow getting white, the mountains getting white, full of snow, and I'm excited about powder. I also get a little bit excited when I look at photos like this. And I think about the last time I skied snow like that, or the next time maybe that I will ski snow like that. All right. So I think a lot of us in this world get excited about skiing powder, or maybe it's corn. It's some form of snow, as long as it's not dripping down the hill and it's liquid, right? So some form of snow gets us pretty excited. So what's interesting is that when we look at excitement, we see that there's research that's looked at how people make decisions under various forms of excitement. And research has demonstrated that under high arousal, such as sexual arousal or anger, people are more risk-taking than people in a neutral state. And one of the authors that's really pioneered this work was, again, George Lowenstein, and his talk is available on the AAA webpage. We also see that arousal has a strong impact on judgment and decision-making. And in one particular study by Ali and Lowenstein in 2006, they saw that sexually aroused participants were more willing to violate social norms and engage in higher risk activities than non-aroused participants. And what they did in this study is they asked a series of college-age students, males for this matter, it's a small sample, they were all male, so maybe females don't have that same response, or maybe it's a different response or a lesser response. But in this particular study, they looked at male response and they asked them questions around their sexual choices and what they might do or not do. They then looked at some pornography, and then they were asked to answer the same survey while watching pornography. And what they saw is that when these young men were really excited, they answered in the survey, they would do all sorts of things, right? Things that most of us would think, oh, that's something that we really shouldn't do. So Andrea, Jerry, and myself started thinking about, I wonder if powder can influence a similar influence. How does powder and the desire to get on powder change our decision-making processes in the backcountry? So what we did is we conducted 2 pilot studies. And the first pilot study looked at decision-making during skiing on a great powder day. And we called that the hot state, although obviously they're cold, but it's their excited state, the hot state. And we compared that to them doing the same survey around decision-making under a cold state. That's when they're at home, clicking through a survey online, kind of like if I asked you to do a survey now, right? You're fairly cold, you're not that excited. So we'd look at the difference between the hot state and the cold state. And this is just a snapshot of our survey, and we'd ask questions like, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, what is your general emotional state? And then we'd ask you some questions like, can you imagine doing these things? Or would you do these things? And these are some of the social norms that we have in backcountry skiing. So can you imagine going out without a transceiver into the backcountry on a considerable hazard day? And you score it from 1 to 7. And what we're hoping to see is that when you're excited and skiing and the snow is really good, that maybe you'd score differently to when you're in a rational cold state answering that survey. And we did the survey last year up at Bridger Bowl. We based it out of the Slushman's Lift. If any of you have skied Bridger Bowl, that is to the far southern end of the ski area. It requires a transceiver to access. It accesses fantastic, very steep terrain. It also is the access point to the backcountry onto Saddle Peak. So we thought this was a really good place to look at people in this excited or this hot state. They'll do this survey, they'll provide us with an email address, and then we'd follow up with them and ask them to repeat that survey when they're in a cold state. At the same time, we did another survey based in Norway that kind of modeled this survey, but had people look at ski movies, like really exciting ski movies at the beginning of the season when everyone was amped, and ask questions before and after that ski movie to look at the change in that decision-making process. So again, if I was standing in front of you right now, I'd ask you, well, do you think it makes a difference? And I think most of us would say, well, yeah, when I'm excited, maybe I'd be a little more relaxed about my decision making. So we're still working through the data. I can't give you a final answer on pattern arousal, but I can tell you that anecdotally, there's a feeling there that most of us can experience, and that we should be aware of that feeling in terms of how we make decisions. So just to wrap up, some key take-home points. Before you get into the backcountry, before you get into the mountains, make sure you get the training, you get the gear, and you get the forecast. We absolutely need to understand what the snowpack's doing, how to use the equipment to be in that environment, and how to move in that environment safely and be safe. So before we even think about decision making or group dynamics or anything else, we need to understand the snow. That's an absolute fundamental. But once we've got an understanding of the snow and we have some idea about what that snowpack is doing, and we're making assessments as we move through that environment, I'd also ask you to think carefully about your motivations. Why are you out there? Why is your partner out there? What's the objective of the day? Are your objectives aligned? Are you trying to do the same sorts of things? Are you doing those things because they're consistent with the conditions, or because your partner is there and you want to show off, or you don't want to let them down? What's going on? Like, why are you making the decisions that you are? Think really critically about why you're there and what you're doing in the backcountry. Part of that is picking good ski buddies, thinking about who you're with and how certain people make you feel, and also how certain people make you make better decisions or poorer decisions. Certainly when I was growing up, I had a friend that we'd always get in trouble. We'd always do stupid stuff. And over time, I spent less and less time with that person, and I chose other people to spend time with. We made better decisions. I think we can all think of ski buddies that always push us in a healthy way, and other ski buddies that maybe push us a little too far beyond what our reasonable risk tolerances are. Be an active member of our community. Being here tonight is a key way of doing that, but also really thinking about how your actions can shape the norms and how we can make a safety culture become the norms that we aspire to, opposed to a gnarly, crazy, very high risk tolerant culture be the norms. I'm not saying those are the norms everywhere, but in certain communities, they certainly are. So think about how your actions and how you can model good behavior can redefine those norms to help the entire community make better decisions as a function of how you behave in the backcountry. And even if you're not the one posting social media and you're not putting those photos out there, by just being in that community and skiing what I would consider safe and normal terrain, opposed to always skiing at the very highest margin of that safety, influences those cultural norms in your community. And then I think the other one that I've been really keen on is thinking about how we can kind of do almost like an intervention, how we can stop and think and engage a higher order, a type 2 thinking or a critical thinking to make sure that the decisions we're making are based on fact and are based on the conditions that we see in front of us today, opposed to how we're feeling and how our group is doing and all these other factors that really don't matter to the avalanche. And the idea that sticks with me is that no matter how good you are or how amazing you are at skiing, the avalanche doesn't care that you're an expert. The avalanche doesn't care that you're a pro skier. The avalanche doesn't care that you got a brand new pair of 115 mil skis underfoot, right? It cares about whether that snow is unstable. So anything we can do to stop and check ourselves and make sure that we're making the right decisions on the day will hopefully keep us safe in the backcountry. And that message will also keep our community safe in the backcountry. That's it from me. Just a couple of ideas around powder arousal and some of the work we're doing in the White Heat Project. I'd love you to take a look at the webpage, take a look at some of our papers, and please feel free to contact me if you have any further questions about the work or some of the ideas that we've discussed. I'm also happy to take some questions tonight. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Shorty, that was an amazing amazing presentation with a lot of good information and good food for thought. Thank you. Does anybody out there in the audience have any questions for Yordi? So first and foremost, we have a question from Saul. Can you dig a little deeper into choosing your ski buddies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So hopefully you can still hear me. Hopefully I'm not unmuted. So I think one of the key ideas around choosing ski buddies is thinking about people that have a consistent view around the objectives of the day. So I used to do a lot of mountaineering, and I spent a long time thinking about who I wanted to go into the mountains with. And the person that was ideal for me to be in the mountains with was somebody who was probably technically more competent than I was, who could technically climb better than me, but whose aspirations were maybe a little bit lower than mine. So they would kind of be the check and balance on what I wanted to maybe try and do in the mountains. And I would also respect their decisions because I knew they were technically better than me and more capable than me. And it would stop and get me to think about what I was doing. I think the dangerous situation is when we feel that we need to show off, or when we feel that we need to impress on the other person that we're good or that we're better than them, or that we're trying to do something that is beyond our skill set in terms of understanding the terrain in the snowpack. So pick good people, pick good mentors, and pick people that are more risk adverse than yourself. And maybe you won't always ski the hardest and steepest line, but you will ski for the rest of your life and have some great powder along the way.
Great advice. Next up, we have a live question from Dan Knavy out there from A3.
Hey, Yordi, how's it going? You know, we had that talk from George the other day. I don't know if you saw that, George Lowenstein, and he was pretty pessimistic about the ability of humans to make decisions in a hot state, you know, and his advice had, you know, he was more into that whole use your watch, not your brain sort of thing. I wonder if you could sort of amplify on that. I mean, given the research that you've done, how do we make better decisions in a hot state?
Yeah, no, very much so. I've spoken to George about this at length, actually, and we've discussed this idea of powder arousal, and his work was critical around this sort of sexual arousal decision-making and the appalling choices that we make when we're aroused. So I think he's entirely right. It's very hard to make completely sensible, completely science-based decisions when it comes to being in a hot or an excited state. One thing that I think is really powerful that we have in the snow and avalanche community is we have ways that we can look at the snowpack. And one of the things that I tell my students, and I tell students that take my classes, is that, you know, even if you don't fully understand every last minutiae of a snowpack, stop and dig a snow pit, all right? Because what that will do is it will kind of cool everybody down, both physically, but also in terms of their emotional and mental state. You can have a look at the snow pit and you can obtain some factual information about what that snow is doing. And if you do a snow pit test, like an ECT, and lo and behold, it actually slides on you, then that's going to be a pretty good way to kind of dampen your enthusiasm and say that skiing this 38-degree slope behind me is a great idea now if that's just gone and slid on me. So I like to think of a snow pit as a really good intervention tool. Ideally, you're getting good, meaningful science information about it. But at the very, very least, you're using it as a pause and stop And now that we've seen this, what can we do to make a better decision? Can we discuss the decision point? Because the other part that we see is that where accidents have happened, there's been a lack of decision making in terms of communication. The communications have broken down. Part of the group has already decided to start skiing a slope, or has already taken their skins off or getting ready to ski a slope. The other part of the group maybe hasn't been communicated with. So I think by getting everybody in your group together, digging a snow pit, stopping, looking at the snow, you can actually come to some sort of consensus and discuss whether you think it's a good idea. And it will take the heat of the moment down just enough that hopefully you can engage some of those critical thinking processes to make a better decision in the backcountry.
Awesome. So we have a question from Jennifer. How does the decision making apply to the red, blue ski tracks maps?
Great. So Jennifer, I think you mean the red-blue maps that I showed right at the beginning. That was some of our ski tracks data that we had a lot of data from the Jackson Hole Teton Pass area. So in that particular case, we saw that depending on the danger rating for the day, we saw different groups out in that terrain. And what we saw is that the danger rating was important, but more important was the composition of the group in terms of determining the type of terrain that they were in. So this kind of gives us a little bit a stop and pause moment, because what it means is that the danger rating does influence how people use the backcountry, but the group is also really important in terms of how we use the backcountry. And that under the same hazard conditions, different groups will use that terrain in very different ways. And really one of the key objectives of that ski tracks work is to try and identify the types of groups, the cohorts that are making the riskiest decisions, with the idea that opposed to looking at an accident, we can try and intervene and identify the groups that are most at risk of making the most dangerous choices under given scenarios. I hope that answers your question there, Jennifer.
All right, thank you. So this question is from Genevieve. Did you look at age demographics in the positional preference research? And just curious if there is stronger social media influence for younger folks.
Yeah, great question. Yes, we did see that age was important. Generally speaking, we see that most of us, as we age, our risk profile changes. I know from personal experience, it's very true. You know, as I've got older, I've become much more risk intolerant. I'm less willing to take risks than I was when I was, say, 18. And we see that in our data as well, is that younger groups are generally taking riskier choices, and there's a higher proportion of them that are positional than the older groups. I can't tell you whether there's a causation related to social media. All I can tell you is that there is a correlation there between those two. And if I were to shoot from the hip here, I would say that there probably is some sort of causation, but we don't have the evidence to drive that conclusion.
Awesome. Jordy, we got a question from Jason. First of all, he says, thank you. And then do you think that apps like Strava influence our decision-making when we're out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think they do. I think they do. I think, you know, depending on the type of person that you are, something like Strava can drive you to do things that are maybe inconsistent with the current conditions, and see where other people are going without maybe fully appreciating the whys and the hows and the wheres. So I think Strava can influence that. The other part of that is that Strava can also influence us in a positive way, in that it can also, you know, not all Strava's on the craziest, gnarliest terrain. There's also just some fun, friendly, mellow tree laps, right? They can show us some good, safe places to go as well. So I think it's up to you as the user to be critical of that information, and just, again, step back and say, why am I making the decisions that I'm doing? Am I just trying to, you know, match the Strava line and beat the Strava time? Or am I doing this to seek some information around some great places that I can get to safely under the current conditions? So trying to engage that critical, that higher order thinking that I think is so critically important when we make decisions in this environment where we get such little feedback.
Very nice. All right, this question is from the Magical Unicorn. Do you think this could easily be translated to rock climbers as well, or potentially other sports, mountaineering and this such.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general broader concepts can. I think one of the challenges that we see with at least the way I ski versus mountaineering, you know, for me, mountaineering was very much a route or an objective based activity. I was thinking about, you know, I've been looking at photos of this peak and I've been looking at photos of this face. I really want to climb that cool area on the left hand side. That particular line is really aesthetic, and I feel rock climbing is very similar to that. Whereas skiing for me sometimes is objective based, but it is much more often just about getting out into the outdoors, getting some good snow, and typically, and especially this year, getting away from people. So I do see that there's some transferability, but there's also some differences there. So I think if we were to situate that in the right way, it could have some transferability to these other sports.
Excellent. This one is from Nick. Jordy, have you considered researching personality traits and avalanche decision making using measures like the NEO or using the big 5 traits?
Yeah, great question. So we've done a couple of things in that direction. A number of years ago, we partnered with one of the lead researchers from Match.com, because apparently, if you're on one of these online dating apps or dating websites, that personality profile is really important, both in terms of who you could be connected with, but also partly in terms of what your risk tolerances are. So that's one avenue we've done. The other one we've used is the brief sensation seeking scale. This is a series of 8 questions that have been used very widely in psychology. And they ask questions like, you know, how much risk do you like to take? And do you like going to unknown places? These kind of really nebulous questions. You're like, well, yeah, maybe, it depends, right? But it turns out that when people answer those questions, they're a very good predictor around what your risk tolerances are. So we have used some tools like that. I'm not aware of sorry, your question scrolled off my screen here. I believe it was the NEO and the Big 5. I'm not aware of those. So I'd love to hear some more about those. But yeah, some of these metrics are very important, and some have really strong predictive power in terms of what people might choose to do in the backcountry. So yes, they're critically important.
Excellent. Next question is from Barry. My thought was, in climbing or backcountry skiing, there's usually a progression of routes. I have seen the last few years the competition to keep up with others. People jump ahead of that learning curve. I think that takes away from building a person's craft. Any thoughts on that concept?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Larry. Thank you for that. I think one of the things that I've seen, the number of people that are extremely fit, that have access to very lightweight equipment. The technology's come so far. Depending on what generation you are, you probably learned on, you know, some Silveretta 404s or something else like that was heavy and cumbersome, would always break down. And what we do see now is that people that are entering the sport, that are maybe coming in from trail running or from competitive cycling, or that kind of have that fitness and aptitude, are able to go and knock out a 7,000, 8,000 foot climb in a day. And that's not a problem to them. Where a lot of us have come from the days where you do a 2,000, 3,000 foot climb as part of a tour, and then you build up and slowly learn some skills as you got onto bigger and bigger objectives. So I do see that happening in some groups. Not everyone is an elite athlete. Not everyone has infinite lung capacity and VO2 max. So we also do see some people coming in kind of doing that more gradual progression as well. The other thing that I also see, especially here in Montana, is how snowmobile technology can facilitate skiers to get into places that used to take a long time to get into. So I think about places like Fraser Basin here in the Bridges. You know, that's 11, 12 mile skiing without a snowmobile. And now you can just jump on someone's snowmobile or get towed in and be in some of the most serious terrain in the Garden Valley in less than half an hour. So, I think technology as well as people's fitness and equipment is in some cases shortening that learning curve. And that doesn't always lead to good outcomes. I think a healthy apprenticeship in this art of learning the backcountry is very, very powerful.
All right, from Jackson, have you researched or are you researching positionality in skiing professionals, either pro athletes or potentially avalanche professionals?
Yeah, so we haven't specifically targeted this group. We may have some people within our data set. We anonymize the data, so I couldn't tell you if we do or don't. It's a key part of all of our survey data is that I can't tell that it's, that it's Johnny down the road. It's just a person of this age and of this particular ability. So we may have some pro skiers in there or some avalanche professionals. I'm certain we have avalanche professionals. I think the professional world, by and large, is a slightly different community. And it's one that generally will favor those that will push things a little further than others. Maybe not on the guiding and safety side, but certainly on the pro skiing and filming side. You're going to get more contracts if you're prepared to ski the steeper lines and do the bigger faces and so forth. So I'm almost positive that there's very strong positionality in that group, but I couldn't tell you that specifically from our data.
Thank you. All right, we got one last question from George, and then we're going to move on to the raffle, the good stuff, right? How does avalanche education level influence risk tolerance in your study?
Yeah, so we saw that avalanche education does not influence. So let me just step it back. In terms of what people would be choosing to do, we saw that the preference of people's terrain choice goes into steeper terrain as they get more experience and more education. And I think this is a question that we have more broadly about avalanche education is how much does it enable people versus how much does it keep people safe? And I think there's a bit of both of those happening. But we also saw that even with greater levels of avalanche education, people were still willing to accept steeper terrain choices in their preferences, but that marginal difference became slightly less over time. So it's a slightly long-winded answer. I guess in a nutshell, one of the key issues here is that if you're a positional type of person, if you care about this positionality issue, even with education, you will still care about those issues. You might have better skills to manage that terrain in the real world setting, but you will still choose and you will still accept, take on more risk if you're a positional type person. So what I would say is maybe some self-awareness. One of the things that we've been throwing around is that part of an avalanche class, maybe we should be getting everybody to do a brief sensation seeking score test so that relative to your group that you ski with, am I the sort of person that's always looking to push things a little more, or am I just, middle of the line? And then if you knew that, then maybe you would check in your decision-making process a little bit more when you're out in the backcountry. So this sort of self-awareness idea is a big part of where our work is going as well. Being aware allows you to have more power over your decisions and hopefully allow you to engage some of that critical thinking before you make an impulsive choice that's not based on the facts.
Excellent. Thank you, Jordy. That was awesome. Great questions from the audience. And yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun to be here. And I wish I was in person with you all, but this has been a great way to do it. And if anyone has any questions after tonight, please get in touch and I'd be happy to help them out.